Hey guys, I'm Ian Featherstone and today we're going to be kicking off a new three-part series titled Does the Bible Hold Up? Next week, David Oakley will be taking us through whether the Bible holds up prophetically, followed by whether it holds up personally. But today, I'm going to be taking us through Does the Bible hold up historically? Anyone who knows me well knows that I have a real passion for history. I grew up on World War II films and days out at Duxford Air Show and other war museums. As an adult, I started to read book after book about historical events like D-Day and Stalingrad, the Roman Empire, the story of the Titanic, and American gangsters like John Dillinger and Al Capone. There's something about real life stories and real people that just fascinates me, and I think we are so lucky to have this stuff passed down to us through history. Believe it or not, up until about 2.5 years ago, if you asked me about Jesus, I would have laughed at you. My opinion was that the Bible was full of fairy tales, and there was probably somebody called Jesus who walked the earth and told good stories. But do you know what I based that opinion on? Absolutely nothing, because I'd never taken the time to look into it for myself. And for somebody who loves history, that was a big mistake. About a month after I started coming to Wesley and Westroad, I started on the Alpha course with Graham Jack, and early into that course I became curious about this fellow called Jesus. I borrowed lots of books from Graham and Victor that talked about the history of the New Testament, and not long into my investigation, I became very interested and quite taken back by the amount of evidence there was for the life, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I remember being halfway through one particular book and suddenly the penny dropped. I remember ringing up Victor and saying, Victor, guess what? Jesus is the Son of God. And Victor said to me, I know, my boy, I know. So it was this historical evidence that brought me to faith and started me on a journey that's been quite remarkable. So today I would like to share that passion with you, and we're going to be looking at whether the Bible holds up historically. I'm going to take you on a little journey of some of the amazing facts that I have discovered along the way. And to do this, we're going to zoom in and we're going to focus on the New Testament. So today we're going to be looking at three things. Firstly, we're going to look at, are the New Testament scriptures reliable? Secondly, we're going to be looking at the Gospels and archaeology with a special focus on Luke and John. And then we're going to zoom in even further and we're going to look at the death and the resurrection of Jesus. So are the New Testament scriptures reliable? The New Testament was written over 2,000 years ago, so how can we be sure that it was handed down to us accurately? Well, let's take this coronavirus pandemic as an example. We're certainly living through something right now that will be going down in the history books. But how will people know that it's true in 2,000 years' time? First of all, it would have been documented, and there will be eyewitness testimony, and there will be pictures and videos. And it's the same thing with things from ancient history, except we don't have the pictures and videos. Instead, we have artifacts pulled out of the ground by archaeologists. And this is the kind of evidence we have for the New Testament. We don't actually have any original copies of the New Testament, or other ancient writings for that matter, so historians use a technique called the bibliographical test to see how reliable and accurate the writings are. The method of this test is to look at the time interval between the book being written and the earliest copies that we have, and then to look at the number of manuscripts that we have in circulation. The shorter the time period between the book being written and the earliest copies shows how reliable the writings are, and the more manuscripts we have to compare, this shows how accurately it's been copied through the years. So let's compare the New Testament to other writings of that era by looking at the chart on the screen. If we look at the writings of the famous Greek philosopher Aristotle, we can see that he wrote his books between 384 and 322 BC. We don't have the original copies, but the earliest copies we have are from 850 AD. That's a massive gap of 1,200 years between it being written and the earliest copies, and we only have 1,000 manuscripts in circulation. If we do the same with some other ancient writings like Caesar's Gallic Wars, you see there's similar results. But if we compare this with the New Testament, the results are astonishing. There's only a gap of between 30 and 150 years between the books of the New Testament being written and the earliest copies, and there's over 25,000 manuscripts in circulation that we can compare. There are no other writings from ancient history that are as well documented and preserved as the New Testament. Historians accept all of those other writings as reliable, so this means the New Testament is the most reliable document in ancient history. Famous scholar Bruce Metzger puts it like this. He says, if we compare the present state of the New Testament text with any other ancient writing, we must declare it to be marvellously correct. The New Testament is unrivaled amongst ancient writings. I personally find this absolutely mind-blowing. It's unrivaled. Nothing else even comes close. But what's more, to back up the accuracy of the New Testament and how it's been passed down to us, check out this awesome fact that I came across. We all know what a Bible commentary is, right? Scholars and Bible teachers look at different books of the Bible and they write down their explanations of the chapters and verses. Well, the early church fathers in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries wrote commentaries on the New Testaments, and from their commentaries we can piece together the entire New Testament, all except 11 verses. This means that if all of the early copies of the New Testament were lost forever, we could still piece it back together from the writings of the church fathers. So far we've looked at the writings of the followers of Jesus, but something that really blew me away was how much is actually written about Jesus by other historians of the time, Jews and Romans who had no reason to elevate Jesus or promote his cause. There was the very famous Jewish historian called Josephus and the famous Roman historian of the time called Tacitus. There were writings from a Roman historian called Pliny the Younger, and most astonishingly of all, Jesus is actually mentioned in the Talmud. That's the central text of Jewish rabbinic law. It's fascinating that without even looking at the New Testament or other Christian writings, we can actually build a timeline of the life of Jesus that includes his death and resurrection. So I think I've made my point here. The New Testament documents have been passed down to us very, very accurately, and they have even been backed up by numerous different independent historians of the time. Historians who had no reason to exalt or exaggerate the stories. Now, the Bible is God's word, and it tells us that all scripture is God-breathed. And I have no doubt that it was God himself who made sure that it was recorded and handed down to us as accurately as possible. I find it hard to believe that we teach ancient history in schools and universities, and what's written on topics like the ancient Greeks, the Egyptians and the Romans is widely accepted as fact, but the Bible is often dismissed as myth. We can truly be confident that when we read our Bibles, we can really trust what is written. The Bible is unrivaled in the way it has been preserved for us and passed down through history. God made sure of that. So let's read it, live it, and walk in its truth. Now we're going to zoom in and we're going to look at the Gospels and archaeology with a special focus on Luke and John. What we have to understand about the Gospels is that they are actually eyewitness testimony. They were written by first-hand eyewitnesses or by people that interviewed eyewitnesses at the time of the events. There were other Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament because they weren't authentic. But we can truly trust that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are authentic. Let's have a closer look at the Gospels, and we're going to start with Luke. Luke wrote nearly a quarter of the New Testament with his Gospel in the book of Acts. Luke's primary objective in his writings was to provide an accurate and reliable account of what had been said and done in the life of Jesus. He makes this clear at the beginning of his Gospel. In Luke 1 verses 1 to 4 he says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the Lord. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." I think Luke is pretty clear there that what he recorded was to the detail. So who was Luke? Luke was a Gentile, the only Gentile author in the Bible, a doctor by profession, so he was used to being meticulous in his detail. He travelled with Paul on his missionary journeys, and he interviewed eyewitnesses to the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, and he recorded the details as accurately as possible. He uses people's official names and titles, especially those who were figures of authority, and he names many towns, cities and countries, so Luke's writings are very historically accurate. One of the world's greatest archaeologists, a guy named Sir William Ramsay, was convinced that Luke's Gospel was written in the 2nd century AD, which would mean it wasn't by Luke and couldn't be trusted. So he set about examining all of the places and names in Luke's Gospel in Acts. As a result of his research, he was forced to do a complete 180 and admit that it was full of complete truth that represented 1st century Palestine. After 30 years of his research, Ramsay said this. He said Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, This author should be placed among the finest of historians. Wow, and that quote's from a guy that's the world's most famous archaeologist. What's more, lots of the places and titles mentioned in Luke's book have been backed up by archaeological findings, giving Luke credible weight as a historian. I just want to take some time to look at an example of how archaeology has proved Luke right. In Acts 17 verse 6, Luke mentions politarchs, which means city officials. The critics said Luke is unreliable because no evidence of the term politarchs existed in any Roman document. Then archaeologists uncovered a 1st century arch that had the inscription politarchs. You can even go and see it now, it's in the British Museum. And since then they have found at least 35 other inscriptions of politarchs. Luke was proved right. And archaeology has proved Luke right time after time. There are literally hundreds of examples I could use today, but we would be here all day. One archaeologist that looked at Luke's work examined 32 ancient countries, 54 ancient cities and 9 ancient islands that Luke mentions, and he couldn't find a single mistake, not one. If Luke was so accurate in documenting these things, then we can be sure that he was accurate in other things, such as Jesus' death and resurrection. Let's have a quick look at John's Gospel as well. There have been a few skeptics, mainly a couple of German theologians, who claim that John's Gospel couldn't have been written by the Apostle John. Instead, they claim that it had been written in about AD 160, way too late for John to have written it, as he would have obviously been dead by then. But in 1934, a historian at a college in Oxford stumbled across a tiny fragment of scroll. Can I start that bit again? But in 1934, a historian at a college in Oxford stumbled across a tiny fragment of scroll that contained 5 verses of chapter 18 of John's Gospel. After it had been examined, historians dated it back to as early as AD 98 and possibly even earlier. So this proves that John's Gospel was written close to Jesus' death and resurrection, and certainly within the lifetime of the Apostle John. It's definitely authentic. On top of that, there was a huge archaeological discovery in Jerusalem that really confirmed some of John's writings, and it really blew me away when I read about it. So check this out. In John chapter 5, Jesus heals a lame man at a pool in Bethesda. The text starts like this. It says, "Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered porticos. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, and the paralysed." You can see from these verses that John was very descriptive and he gave lots of detail, but critics said that John's Gospel must be inaccurate because no place like it has ever been discovered. They said if he can't get this right, then surely we can't trust the rest of his writings. But that theory was blown to pieces in the late 19th century when archaeologists discovered the pool 40 feet underground, but exactly where John said it was, by the Sheep's Gate in Jerusalem. Not only that, the pool had the 5 covered porticos, just as John said it did. There have been numerous other discoveries that back up John's writings, including the pool of Siloam in John 9:7 and Jacob's well from John 4:12. So there's a whole wealth of evidence to show that the Gospels are extremely accurate historical accounts of the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. In fact, famous Australian archaeologist Clifford Wilson puts it like this. He says, "Those who knew the facts now recognise that the New Testament must be accepted as a remarkably accurate source book." We are living in times of great uncertainty right now. We don't know when we will go back to our normal way of life or when we'll be able to connect with our loved ones in person. But we can be 100% certain that what we read in the pages of our Bible is accurate and reliable. It's the one real certainty that we can hold on to through the chaos that we are experiencing. Let's move on and have a look at the death and resurrection of Jesus. The fact is, the whole of the Christian faith is built around the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead after being crucified, then, can I start that little bit again?
Sure, yeah. You're doing well.
The fact is, the whole of the Christian faith is built around the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead after being crucified, then our faith is a fake, a fraud and a counterfeit. David Oakley may as well order a huge wrecking ball and smash down the church, because we would have all believed in a lie. Paul even confirms this in 1 Corinthians 15:17. He says, if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is useless and you are still guilty of your sins. But if it is true, then it's the most important event ever known to mankind. So to be sure that the resurrection really happened, we need evidence of two things. Firstly, we need evidence that Jesus was really dead. And secondly, we need evidence that he was seen alive after he was buried in the tomb. So was Jesus really dead? What evidence is there to suggest that Jesus really died on the cross and that he hadn't just passed out and was later resuscitated? Firstly, Jesus went through a brutal torture. He was crucified. Jesus went through a brutal torture before he was crucified. Roman floggings were horrific and usually consisted of at least 39 lashes with a whip that was made of braided leather and had metal balls and sharp pieces of bones woven into it. After a Roman flogging, the victim's back would be shredded to pieces and veins and bones would be on display. This was often enough to kill the victim. After that, Jesus was made to carry his own cross, so he would have been in pretty bad shape before he was even crucified. But there is one fact in John's Gospel that recorded so accurately that Jesus was dead on the cross. Let's have a look in John 19:33-34. It says, when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. One of the soldiers, however, pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water flowed out. This report is from an eyewitness giving an accurate account. When someone dies on the cross, the cause of death is asphyxiation and heart failure. Alexander Meverell, a medical expert from the University of Miami, says that when someone dies of asphyxiation, a fluid builds up around the heart and lungs. He says that when the spear was pulled out, a fluid came out. This would have the appearance of a clear fluid like water, followed by a large volume of blood, just as John described. I think it's amazing that John recorded what was observed 2,000 years ago, and today medical experts can testify that John's observations are exactly what they would expect to see from a victim of crucifixion. So we can be sure from history that Jesus was dead. So was Jesus seen alive after he was buried in the tomb? I hope I've been able to show quite conclusively that the New Testament is a reliable historical document and that we can trust what's recorded in its pages. With that in mind, let's see what historical evidence there is to show that Jesus really was raised from the dead. I've mentioned several times the importance of eyewitnesses when looking at history. The more people that witnessed an event, then the more we can rely on its accuracy. The Gospels are full of accounts of eyewitnesses who saw Jesus alive after he was buried in the tomb. He appeared to Mary Magdalene in John 20. He appeared to the other women in Matthew 28. He appeared to Cleopas on the road to Emmaus, to 11 disciples in Luke 24, to 10 apostles in John 20, to Thomas and the others in John 20, to 7 apostles in John 21, to the disciples in Matthew 28, and then he appeared to the disciples on the Mount of Olives. Just these accounts on their own are enough to show that Jesus really was seen after his death, but there's one more account that really cements the resurrection as a historical fact. In 1 Corinthians 15:4-6 it says, he was buried and he was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the scriptures said. He was seen by Peter and then by the 12. After that he was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Wow, I don't know about you, but for me that just seals it. If Jesus was seen by over 500 people at one time, then it's certain that he was raised from the dead. 1 Corinthians is one of the early letters written by Paul. Most scholars agree that it was written less than 30 years after Jesus' crucifixion. That means most of the witnesses were still alive when Paul wrote it. He says that himself in the passage. Paul is literally saying, here, look, most of the witnesses are still alive. Go and ask them if you want. They will tell you. And just to put this into context, this would be like in 20 years' time from now, Graham Jack writing an account of how coronavirus affected the church. You would be able to go and physically ask those people. You could knock on their doors and say, hey, you was there. Is it true what was written? And they'd be able to clarify it for you. And this is exactly what's happening with Paul in 1 Corinthians. It's remarkable how many eyewitnesses there are that saw Jesus alive after he was buried. Imagine someone was on trial at a big court case and there was over 500 eyewitnesses who witnessed the crime. The jury would be unanimous and they would literally throw away the key. I just want to finish this point with a quote from a guy called Dr. Simon Greenleaf. He was a Royal Professor of Law at Harvard University. He wanted to find out the truth of the resurrection, so he used his skills of law investigation to examine the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. After he had finished his research, he said this. He said, according to the laws of legal evidence used in a court of law, there is more evidence for the historical fact of the resurrection of Jesus than just about any other event in history. Wow, I mean, this isn't Mickey Mouse stuff. This guy isn't even a Christian scholar. He's a Royal Professor of Law at Harvard. That means he's mustard. So as we draw to a close, I just want to ask you, what does all this mean for us today? It's lovely to know all of these amazing historical facts that prove the reliability of the Bible, but so what? Well, first of all, in 1 Peter 3:15 it tells us, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. There are a lot of people out there who were like me a couple of years ago, who just laugh at the Bible and don't take it seriously. They think it's fairy tales or that Jesus was just a good teacher. In an age of science, people dismiss stuff like the resurrection as myth. And in a country where only about 5% of people go to church, I'm guessing there's quite a few people like that. We live and work amongst these people, so let's arm ourselves with the facts. Because in this age of science, technology and rationality, we can show that our faith is built on rock-solid truth, hard evidence and logical thinking. The kind of facts I've presented today can be a potent weapon for evangelism. But that's not the main point that I want you to think about today. We have proved that Jesus was crucified and that he rose from the dead after 3 days. History says so. This means that everything we know about Jesus, everything he did and everything he said in the Gospels was true. But how many of us are realising this and walking in this truth in our daily lives? How many of us are still caught up in the world and being held captive by philosophy and empty deceit? How many of us are taking bits of his teaching and dismissing the rest in partial obedience? So I ask you today, how big is your Jesus? I mean, who is this man that has nearly 3 billion followers across the globe? Who is this man that even the winds and the waves and the evil spirits obey him? Who is this man that walks on water, calms the storms and heals the sick? Who is this man that takes your sin and wears it, takes your shame and bears it, and takes the list of your wrongs and tears it? Because in this current climate of this coronavirus pandemic, we don't need a good moral teacher. We don't need somebody who tells good stories. We don't need someone to just follow. We need Jesus Christ, the unique Son of God, who died on the cross and was raised on the 3rd day. The best attested fact in all of history.